John gripped the porch railing, trying to take a deep breath, but instead, he coughed so violently that he doubled over. Emma rushed to him, but he couldn't keep his balance and collapsed onto the ground. His face was pale, his lips had turned blue, and his breathing had become shallow and wheezy. "John! John!" she cried out, her trembling hands desperately searching for his pulse. For a moment, she thought she couldn't feel it, and an icy terror gripped her from within. A wave of panic froze her in place, but then, forcing herself to act, she ran for the phone. She knew, if help didn't come in time, she might lose him. Chapter 1: A Troubling Sign. It was an early morning on the farm, the sky painted in soft hues of orange and pink as the sun began its slow ascent above the hills. The quiet sound of birds chirping echoed through the open windows of the farmhouse, blending with the rhythmic hum of the wind brushing through the trees. John and Emma had always cherished these peaceful mornings. The farm, with all its animals and fields, had been their life for many years, and in these moments, they felt a deep sense of contentment. The hustle and bustle of farm work was still to come. For now, the morning was theirs to savor. John, tall and lean with a thick shock of gray hair, was sitting at the old wooden kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea in his hands. His deep blue eyes flickered with quiet reflection as he gazed out at the view. Emma, with her silver hair neatly tied back in a bun, was busy preparing breakfast. The smell of fresh bread and sizzling eggs filled the air. Their little farm was modest, but it was theirs, and it provided everything they needed. They had pigs, geese, ducks, rabbits, and 2 cows, each one a part of the small, interconnected world they had carefully cultivated. "How's the weather looking today, love?" Emma asked, glancing over her shoulder at John, her voice warm but slightly distracted as she flipped a piece of toast. John squinted out the window. "Looks like it'll be a fine day. A bit cool, but perfect for getting some work done outside." He took a sip of his tea, savoring the warmth. Emma smiled, her heart swelling with the simple pleasure of the morning routine. "I'm thinking of checking on the chickens after breakfast. We've had a few eggs go missing lately. I want to make sure they're all doing all right." John nodded, his gaze returning to the fields. "Right, we need to keep an eye on them. I'll go check on the pigs after we eat." The tranquility of the morning was shattered, however, as Emma's sharp eyes caught something unusual out the corner of her vision. She set the bread knife down and walked over to the kitchen window, narrowing her gaze. The chickens, usually so lively, clucking and pecking around the yard, seemed different. They were huddled together near the barn, and several of them appeared to be standing still, their feathers ruffled, their postures slumped. "John, come here," Emma called softly, her voice tinged with concern. John stood and walked over to her side. "What is it?" "I don't know, but something's wrong with the chickens," Emma replied, her brow furrowed. "Look at them." John followed her gaze, squinting. I see what you mean. That doesn't look right. They should be moving around more." Together, they watched as the chickens seemed listless, some of them standing completely still while others appeared to be weakly scratching the ground. Emma's heart skipped a beat. This was not the usual behavior for their flock. Something was wrong. Something more than just a little cold snap or a passing storm. But what? "We should go check on them," John said, his tone steady, though a hint of unease lingered in his voice. The 2 of them made their way outside, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound breaking the silence. As they neared the chicken coop, they noticed several of the hens with missing feathers, their normally vibrant plumage now dull and ragged. Emma's concern deepened. A few of the chickens were standing apart from the others, their bodies trembling slightly, as though they were cold or in pain. "Is it just me, or are they sick?" Emma asked, her voice quiet, as if saying it aloud would somehow make it real. John crouched down and gently stroked one of the hens that had been standing apart. "I think you're right," he said grimly, inspecting the bird's body. "Look at these feathers. They're falling out, and she's not eating or moving much. Something's not right." They moved quickly, checking each of the chickens in turn. Some of them were worse off than others. Dull eyes, lethargic movements, and patches of missing feathers. A few were even lying motionless on the ground. Emma's heart sank. These chickens weren't just sick, they were very sick. It was as if some invisible force had come over them, stripping them of their energy and vitality. "We need to isolate the sick ones," John said, standing up slowly, his face tight with worry. "We can't let whatever this is spread to the others." Emma nodded. "I'll grab some fresh straw and get the isolation pen ready." They worked quickly, separating the ill birds from the healthy ones and placing them in a small, enclosed area at the far end of the farmyard. As Emma moved to comfort the stricken chickens, John went inside to fetch their first aid supplies and disinfectant. The day dragged on slowly as they worked to contain the problem. John called the local veterinarian, but the clinic was closed until the afternoon. As they waited for advice, Emma couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something worse was coming. This wasn't just some minor illness that would pass in a day or two. The chickens' condition was deteriorating rapidly. As she watched them, tending to their wounds and giving them water, a small shadow caught her eye. One of the ducklings, usually playful and full of energy, had wandered off from the others and was standing by itself in the corner of the yard. Emma frowned and called to it gently, but the duckling didn't respond. She went over to it, her heart sinking. The little bird was still, its feathers fluffed up in the cold air, and it was breathing irregularly. "John," Emma said softly, her voice filled with concern. "The duckling is not moving right. It looks like it's sick too." John rushed over, his face already showing the strain of worry. He bent down beside the duckling, inspecting it carefully. "It's weak," he muttered, running a hand through his beard. "Just like the chickens." Emma stood up, feeling a sense of dread wash over her. "This could spread to the other animals, can't it?" "I'm afraid it could," John replied, his voice heavy. "We need to be cautious, and we need to act fast." The two of them spent the rest of the morning cleaning, disinfecting, and isolating all of the affected animals. But the atmosphere on the farm had shifted. The usual calm and quiet had been replaced by a tense, uneasy silence. As the afternoon wore on, John started to feel strange. A tickle in his throat at first, and then a dry cough that seemed to get worse with every passing hour. He tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the stress of the morning's events. But as the sun began to set, he could no longer pretend that he was fine. Emma noticed his growing discomfort as he stood beside her, watching the sunset. "John, are you all right?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. John cleared his throat, attempting to mask the raspy cough that had started to make his chest ache. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice cracked slightly. "Just a little tired, I think." Emma wasn't convinced. "You've been coughing for hours now, love. Maybe you should sit down for a bit." John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's probably nothing, just all this worry with the animals. I'll be fine." But Emma wasn't so sure. She could see the weariness in his eyes, the subtle signs that his health was slipping away. "Let's get inside," she said softly, her concern deepening. "We'll have some tea and rest for a while." "I don't like the look of this, John." As they made their way back to the house, Emma's mind raced. She had no idea what was happening to their animals, but something was clearly wrong. And now, John had started showing signs of illness too. She just hoped it wasn't too late to find a solution. Chapter 2, On the Edge of Loss. The days following the troubling signs in the chicken coop were some of the hardest John and Emma had ever faced on the farm. The morning sun would rise, casting golden light over the fields, but it no longer brought them comfort. The weight of illness, both the sickness creeping through their animals and the one now invading John's own body, hung heavy in the air. Emma had always been the steady one, the rock upon which John could lean, but now she felt her own strength waning. John's condition worsened each day. He had been coughing more violently now, the hacking racking his chest as though his body was being torn apart from the inside. He would try to get out of bed to help with the animals, but his limbs felt weak, and his head spun whenever he stood up. He had started running a fever, and Emma's worry deepened with each passing hour. The man she had spent so many years with, her partner, her equal, was slipping away from her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "John," Emma murmured one morning, her voice cracking as she helped him sit up in bed. "You need to rest." "I'm fine," he insisted, though his face was pale and his eyes bloodshot. "There's too much to be done. The animals will have to wait," Emma said firmly, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "You won't help them if you don't take care of yourself." But despite her insistence, John knew she was right. He could feel his own energy draining with each passing moment. Still, even as he lay there, his mind raced with thoughts of the farm, of the chickens, and of what they could do to contain this disease before it spread further. Emma spent every waking hour tending to the farm, making sure each animal was taken care of. She checked the pigs, the cows, and the rabbits, though it seemed the disease was only affecting the poultry. The ducks and geese appeared to be in good health, their bright eyes and energetic movements offering her a small sliver of hope amidst the darkness. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before whatever was causing the chickens to die would reach them too. Her heart sank as she made her way to the chicken coop that morning. The sight that greeted her was worse than she had feared. One by one, the chickens were falling, their fragile bodies limp and lifeless. She counted 4 dead on the ground, and there were more showing the same signs: ruffled feathers, dull eyes, and lethargy. Emma didn't know how much longer they could keep isolating them. Felt like a losing battle. Her hands trembled as she carefully removed the lifeless birds, placing them in a separate area to be dealt with later. The silence in the coop was deafening. The usual clucks and calls of the chickens were gone, replaced only by the soft rustle of straw and the occasional cough from one of the still living birds. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. She had no time for grief, not yet. There was still work to be done. As she worked, John called out weakly from the farmhouse, his voice hoarse. Emma hurried inside, her heart pounding. "John!" He lay on the couch, a blanket pulled over his shoulders. His face was flushed with fever, his eyes glassy and distant. He struggled to sit up as she approached, his breath shallow. "Emma," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. We need to make a decision about the animals." "What do you mean?" she asked, kneeling beside him, her worry deepening. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice growing weaker with each word. We need to isolate everything. All the animals. Quarantine. It's the only way to stop it from spreading." Emma's heart skipped a beat. A quarantine, of course. She had been too focused on the immediate task of trying to save the chickens to think of the bigger picture. John's suggestion made sense. They would need to keep the healthy animals far away from the sick ones, even if it meant separating them entirely. It was their only hope of containing the disease before it wiped out everything. "I'll get to work on it," Emma said, her voice resolute despite the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. She kissed his forehead gently, then stood and hurried back outside. The day passed in a blur of activity as Emma set up temporary pens and quarantine areas for each of the animals. She moved the cows, pigs, ducks, and rabbits to the farthest end of the farm, away from the sick chickens and the isolation pen. It was hard work, physically exhausting, but it kept her mind focused on the task at hand. The disease wasn't just taking away their animals, it was threatening the life they had built here on the farm. As the sun began to set, Emma finally allowed herself a moment of rest. She sat down on the porch, staring out at the vast open fields that stretched before her. She had done everything she could, but there was no way to know if the quarantine would work. The worry gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. There was nothing else to be done tonight. John's health continued to deteriorate, and Emma's concern for him grew deeper. She stayed by his side, doing what she could to ease his suffering, but there was little she could do. Her only solace was that she had arranged for a local veterinarian to visit the next morning. Maybe they could shed some light on what was happening, give them a plan of action that would help. But even as Emma made her way to the barn to check on the animals one last time before bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The night was cool, and the air smelled of earth and hay, but there was an unfamiliar scent in the air. Something sharp, almost chemical. She walked carefully through the barn, checking on each animal, her heart racing with each step. As she passed by the hayloft, something caught her eye. There, in the corner of the barn, was a strange, almost oily trail leading toward the back door. The tracks were faint, but they were unmistakable. It looked like someone had entered the barn recently. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Had someone brought this disease to the farm? She knelt down, examining the tracks closely. The strange oily residue left behind didn't seem natural. Emma's mind raced. If the disease had been brought in from the outside, then they were dealing with something much more dangerous than she had thought. With trembling hands, she stood up, her mind already made up. Tomorrow they would go to the veterinarian, but she knew now that this was no ordinary illness. Whatever was happening here was far worse than she had imagined. Chapter 3. The veterinarian in search of a solution. The morning air was thick with tension as Emma and John waited for the veterinarian to arrive. After yesterday's unsettling discovery, Emma had made arrangements for a specialist to visit, hoping they would have answers. She stood by the door, glancing out toward the empty fields as if waiting for some sign, some reassurance that things would get better. But in the pit of her stomach, she knew the worst wasn't over. The sound of tires crunching on gravel alerted her to the vet's arrival. She rushed to meet him, her heart racing, but she forced herself to take a deep breath, reminding herself that she needed to stay strong. For John, for the animals. Dr. Harris was an older man, known for his calm demeanor and sharp expertise, especially when it came to unusual illnesses. He was one of the few who might have a clue about what was happening to their flock. He took a quick look at the dying chickens and the listless ducks before turning to Emma and John with a grave expression. "It's an unknown infection," Dr. Harris explained, his voice heavy with concern. "It's affecting only the poultry. We've seen a few cases of this in neighboring farms, but nothing like this. The symptoms are strikingly similar to avian influenza, but the way it's spreading, it doesn't fit the usual pattern. I'm afraid we'll need to isolate any remaining birds, and I'll start by testing for other potential diseases." Emma's heart sank as the words hit her like a hammer. They had been hoping for a simple explanation, something manageable, but what he was saying sounded far worse. The disease wasn't just ravaging their chickens. It was something they might not be able to stop. "We've already quarantined the animals," Emma said, her voice tight. "But we don't have much left. I don't know how much longer we can keep them isolated without something to help them." Dr. Harris nodded gravely. "We'll need to act fast. I'm going to provide you with a few treatments that may help slow the infection's progression. But the key will be hygiene, constant cleaning, and disinfection. Anything that comes in contact with the infected birds needs to be sterilized." With renewed determination, John and Emma set to work. They began meticulously cleaning every stall, cage, and coop. They scrubbed with hot water, soap, and disinfectant, wiping down every surface. It was exhausting work, but there was no other choice. Each minute they spent cleaning was a minute they were buying in the fight against the infection. Emma's hands were raw from the scrubbing, but she didn't allow herself a moment of rest. The farm, their life's work, was slipping away, and she couldn't afford to let it happen. John, despite his worsening condition, insisted on helping. Though his face was pale and his cough was getting worse, he didn't want to sit idly by. "We have to keep them safe, Emma," he said through gritted teeth as he picked up another bucket of water. His voice was weak, but his resolve was unshaken. "We have to try everything we can." As the day wore on, they followed the vet's instructions to the letter, giving the remaining poultry the recommended medicines. John's hands trembled slightly as he carefully administered the first dose to one of the ducks. He was growing weaker, but Emma tried to focus on the task at hand, not on how much more fragile he had become. But then, as they worked their way through the barn, something else caught Emma's eye. One of the ducks, the youngest of the group, was now sluggish, her feathers drooping, her once bright eyes dull. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't lose another one. The ducks had been their one solace, their hope in the face of all the destruction. If she lost this duck, there would be nothing left to save. "No, no, no," she muttered to herself as she knelt beside the bird, gently lifting it into her arms. Please, don't let this happen. She tried to administer the medication, but the duck didn't respond. It was as if the infection had already taken hold of her, and Emma's worst fears were beginning to come true. She sat there, cradling the duck in her arms, desperately willing it to get better, but deep down, she knew she couldn't keep it alive forever. John stumbled over to her, his face flushed with fever and exhaustion. He coughed violently, his chest heaving as he reached out to help. We have to keep trying, he rasped, his voice filled with desperation. We can't stop now. You're doing everything you can, Emma. Emma met his gaze, her eyes filled with tears. I can't do this without you, John. He smiled weakly, though it didn't reach his eyes. You've never had to. We're in this together. And yet, despite their efforts, the disease spread further. With each passing hour, more birds succumbed to the infection. Emma could feel the weight of each loss, a crushing burden that threatened to crush her spirit. But even as her hope dwindled, John refused to give up. He insisted on experimenting with different medications, mixing various remedies the vet had provided in an attempt to find something that might work. Though it seemed reckless, Emma could see the determination in his eyes, the same determination he had always shown when faced with challenges on the farm. I know I'm not a doctor, he muttered one evening, as he mixed a batch of herbs and powders, but maybe something here will make a difference. I have to believe that. Emma stood by his side, watching as he worked, feeling the desperation that filled the space between them. She wanted to tell him to rest, to give up the experiments, but she couldn't bring herself to. She couldn't take away his last hope. Then, just as they were about to finish for the night, something unexpected happened. John suddenly staggered back from his workbench, clutching his chest. His face twisted in pain as he collapsed onto the floor. John! Emma screamed, rushing to his side. She shook him, her hands trembling. John, no. Please, don't. But as his body went limp, her heart stopped. For a moment, the world around her seemed to blur, and she couldn't breathe. She had to do something, anything. But what? She had no idea what to do, no idea how to save him or how to save the farm. Chapter 4: Moments of Despair. The hospital room was cold, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of machines the only sounds in the stillness. John lay unconscious in the bed, his face pale, his body weak from the fever that had taken hold of him. Emma sat beside him, holding his hand, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, praying that he would wake up and tell her everything was going to be okay. But the silence between them felt heavy, like a weight she couldn't lift. She had been alone for days now, alone on the farm, alone with the animals, and alone with her fear. Her only company was the sound of her own thoughts, each one darker than the last. John's condition was still uncertain, and the farm, once a place of life and joy, now felt like a battlefield, every corner filled with death and disease. Please, John, she whispered, her voice breaking. Please wake up. I can't do this alone. But he didn't respond, and Emma knew, deep down, that even if he did wake, there was no guarantee he'd be the same. The disease had taken so much from them already. She didn't know how much more they could lose. Back on the farm, Emma struggled to keep everything together. The farm chores, once routine and familiar, now felt insurmountable. She forced herself to rise each day before the sun, checking on the animals, cleaning the stalls, and administering the medications John had prepared before he fell ill. The animals, though, seemed to sense her exhaustion. They had been so accustomed to her warmth and energy, and now they watched her with cautious eyes, perhaps sensing that their caretaker was beginning to lose her fight. It was on the third morning after John's hospitalization that Emma found herself struggling to keep her eyes open as she fed the pigs. The steady, rhythmic motion of scraping feed into their troughs felt like a distant, unreachable task. Her hands were trembling, her body ached from lack of sleep, and each breath she took felt like it required more effort than the last. As she walked past the barn, her heart nearly stopped when she saw the unmistakable signs of illness on one of the cows. Bella, their largest cow, was lying down in the straw, her body shivering and her breath shallow. Emma knelt beside her, feeling the familiar warmth of her body. But it was wrong. Bella was burning with fever. The same symptoms that had taken their chickens and ducks now threatened her beloved cow. "No, not Bella. Please not you too," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Her mind raced. Was there anything left she could do? She reached for the syringe of medicine the vet had left for emergencies. But her hands fumbled, her vision blurred from the fatigue. She couldn't do this alone. She needed help. But John was in the hospital, too ill to even talk, and the vet's visits were infrequent. His attention divided between so many farms already. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a shaky breath. She had to fight. For Bella, for John, for the farm. She would not let them lose everything. That afternoon, Emma returned to the barn to check on Bella. She had tried to rest earlier in the day, but sleep never came. Her thoughts were too clouded, and every time she closed her eyes, the fear of what was happening on the farm would resurface, more intense than before. As she entered the barn, a cold shiver ran down her spine. Bella's condition had worsened. The cow was no longer moving, her eyes dull and unfocused. Emma rushed to her side, checking for a pulse. There was nothing. Bella was gone. Tears sprang to Emma's eyes, but she didn't have the luxury of weeping for long. There was no time. If she stopped now, if she allowed herself to break, she feared everything would fall apart. Bella had been more than just a cow. She had been a part of the family, a constant companion on the farm, and now she was gone. Another casualty of the strange, deadly illness that seemed to haunt their lives. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and stood up, her legs weak, her heart heavy. She could feel the weight of the loss pressing down on her chest, threatening to suffocate her. But she didn't allow herself to collapse. She couldn't. "I won't give up," she whispered to the empty barn. "I won't." The days continued to bleed together. Emma worked tirelessly to care for the remaining animals, cleaning, feeding, and medicating them as best she could. But despite her best efforts, the disease didn't relent. One by one, the remaining chickens perished, followed by the ducks, and then, to her horror, a second cow began to show signs of illness. Emma felt as though she was drowning, each breath harder than the last, but she kept going. She refused to stop. Each time she felt her strength wavering, she thought of John, still lying in the hospital, and of the farm that had given them everything they had. She couldn't give up now, not when so many lives depended on her. But despite all her efforts, the situation continued to spiral. Another cow, Clara, their second largest, succumbed to the disease. Emma held her as she passed, her hands trembling as she stroked the cow's soft fur. A silent goodbye for yet another cherished animal. That night, as she sat alone on the porch, staring out at the empty fields, Emma felt as though the entire world was closing in on her. The farm, the animals, even her own body. It all felt like it was slipping through her fingers. And yet, in the quiet of the night, she made herself a promise. "I won't give up," she repeated, her voice raw with emotion. "I can't. I won't." And though she didn't know how much longer she could keep fighting, one thing was certain. She would not stop until the last breath left her body. For John, for the animals, for everything they had built. Chapter 5, In Search of Help. Emma sat at the kitchen table, the empty mugs of coffee stacked beside her, the last sip of warmth long gone. She stared at the window, watching the sky darken as another day passed without any sign of improvement. It had been a week since John had been taken to the hospital, and though he was now stable, still too weak to help, his absence weighed heavily on her. The farm was dying, and so much of it seemed beyond her control. She had reached out to the other farmers in the area, hoping for advice, for a solution. But the advice they offered was the same tired advice she had heard before. Quarantine, clean everything, try new medications. But none of it was working. It was as if the disease was unstoppable. Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone again. She couldn't call John. She knew he was too ill to do anything. She couldn't call the vet either. Dr. Harris had already been stretched thin, trying to help so many others. But maybe there was something else. Someone else who could help her. That night, after the sun set and the barn grew cold, Emma grabbed her coat and headed out, determined to find someone who might have answers. Emma made the long drive to the neighboring farm, where the Blakes, an experienced couple, lived and worked. They were the kind of farmers who had been through every hardship, every storm, and every illness that could affect livestock. Surely they would know what to do. When she arrived, the couple was already tending to their own animals. They greeted Emma warmly, though their faces quickly fell when they saw the exhaustion in her eyes and the strain in her voice. "Emma, what's happened to your farm?" Mrs. Blake asked gently, her eyes scanning Emma's face for any sign of hope. "It's the birds," Emma said, her voice hoarse. "Something's taken them, and now it's spreading to the cows. The disease, I can't seem to stop it." Mr. Blake nodded slowly. "I'm sorry to hear that. You're not the only one struggling with it, but I'm afraid we've had no luck either. Some things you just can't fight." Their words were comforting, in a way. They were sympathetic, but they weren't offering any real solutions. Emma felt a pang of frustration. She had come for answers, for something that would give her a glimmer of hope, but now she only felt more lost. "I've tried everything," Emma said, shaking her head. "The quarantine, the disinfecting, none of it is working. I need something more." Mr. Blake paused, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Sometimes the more you try, the worse things get. What you need is rest. But I know that's easier said than done when you've got so much riding on it." "But rest isn't an option," Emma said quickly. "I can't let the animals suffer anymore. I have to keep trying." The Blakes exchanged a look. Mrs. Blake sighed, her gaze softening. "We can give you the same advice we've already given to others. Keep trying to treat them, but if you're looking for something that's going to work right away, I'm afraid I can't help you. I've heard that there's nothing that's proven to be effective." Emma stood up, feeling the weight of their words. She appreciated their sympathy, but it wasn't enough. "Thank you, but I need something more." And with that, she left their farm, her resolve stronger than ever. There had to be something out there, something that could save her animals. Back at her own farm, Emma tried once again to stick to the routine she had set. Every morning, she fed the pigs, cleaned the pens, and then focused on the birds. She made sure to keep them isolated and provided fresh water and food. But with each passing day, it felt like the disease spread further, claiming more lives. The ducks, which she had nurtured with extra care, now showed the same signs of weakness that had taken their chickens. Emma's heart sank. Her hope was dwindling, but she refused to give up. She stayed on her feet, moving from one animal to the next, desperately trying to make a difference. Yet, with each new loss, she felt herself slipping further into despair. She had worked tirelessly, but the disease never seemed to stop. After a long, grueling day, she stood in the barn, watching over the remaining animals, when her eyes landed on a shelf in the corner. It was a shelf of old books, many of which hadn't been opened in years. One book caught her attention. It was a thick, weathered manual about farm health and animal care. She hesitated before pulling it down from the shelf. It was old, much older than she was used to, but something about it made her feel like it could hold the answers she so desperately needed. She flipped through the pages, reading about diseases, infections, and remedies from a time when medicine hadn't yet advanced as far as it had today. The methods were outdated, but the principles were the same. There, tucked between the pages, she found a chapter on rare infections that seemed eerily similar to what her animals were suffering from. Her eyes scanned the text feverishly. There it was, a treatment, one that hadn't been mentioned in any of the advice she had received from the Blakes or the vet. A mixture of herbs, some of which she recognized, and a specific kind of disinfectant that could potentially halt the spread of the infection. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something she could try. With renewed determination, Emma set to work, gathering the ingredients. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. She had to try, for John, for the animals, for the farm. As she prepared the mixture, she felt a spark of hope, a rare, fleeting moment of optimism. Maybe this would work. Maybe, just maybe, this was the answer. But as the night wore on, and she administered the treatment to the remaining birds and the cows, she couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late. The disease had already taken so much from her. Could she really turn things around? Chapter 6. A Strange Discovery. The early morning sun filtered through the curtains as Emma sat beside John's bed. He had finally returned from the hospital, still weak but determined to help with the farm. His breathing was steady now, the coughs less frequent, and he managed a weak smile when he saw her. "I've missed you," he said softly, his voice hoarse from the illness that had gripped him so fiercely. Emma smiled back, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "I've missed you too, John, but we have so much to do now." They had spent the last few days caring for the animals, cleaning the pens, and following the veterinarian's advice. The disease still hovered over the farm like a shadow, but they were trying everything they could. Emma was exhausted, but she couldn't rest until she knew they were doing everything possible to save the animals. That morning, as they walked through the barn together, something caught Emma's attention. One of the ducks, which had been on the verge of death only the day before, seemed to be standing straighter, pecking at the ground with energy she hadn't seen in days. "John," Emma said, her voice trembling with disbelief, "look at this. She's getting better." John squinted at the duck, his brow furrowed in confusion. "That can't be right," he muttered. "We haven't seen any improvement for days. This doesn't make sense." Emma felt a rush of hope, but she also felt a pang of concern. If this one duck was improving, could there be a solution? Or was it just a fluke? The uncertainty weighed heavily on her mind. Later that afternoon, after a long conversation with the veterinarian, Emma and John made a startling discovery. Dr. Harris, who had been their lifeline throughout the ordeal, suggested that the infection might have been introduced from an external source, a contamination that could have entered their supply of feed. The idea hit them like a bolt of lightning. They had assumed the sickness had started within their flock, but perhaps someone, had brought it in from the outside. The feed had always been delivered in bulk, but they never thought to check it for contamination. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma and John made their way to the feed storage area. The barn smelled faintly of hay and earth, a comforting scent, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in her chest as she approached the crates of feed. She opened one of the containers carefully, sifting through the grains with trembling fingers. To her horror, she found small, unmistakable tracks, tiny footprints that led to the corner of the storage area. "John," Emma whispered, kneeling down to inspect the evidence more closely. "There's something here." John knelt beside her, following her gaze to the signs of gnawing marks on the bags of grain. "Rats," he muttered grimly. "This is how it's getting in. They've been sneaking into the feed." Emma's heart sank. The thought that rodents might have carried the disease from one animal to another, contaminating the food and spreading the infection, was terrifying. She had never considered it before, too focused on the immediate symptoms to think of external causes. She stood up, feeling a mixture of anger and frustration. "How could we have missed this?" she said, her voice tight. "We should have been more careful. We should have checked everything." John placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "We didn't know, Emma, but now we do. We'll fix it." They immediately set to work. The next few hours were spent cleaning out the feed storage area, throwing out the contaminated supplies, and replacing everything with fresh, sealed containers. They also set traps around the barn to deal with the rodents, making sure the farm was thoroughly disinfected. But it wasn't just the food that needed attention. Emma realized that the farm's overall sanitary conditions were far from ideal. The disease might have had an easier time taking hold because of the unchecked filth in some of the pens and stalls. There was so much more to do than they had ever realized. "I think we should put all the animals in quarantine," Emma said, her voice determined. "We can't risk this spreading further." John agreed. "We'll keep them separate from each other. No one leaves the pens until we're sure everything's under control." With a sense of urgency, they set up temporary quarantine areas for all their animals. They isolated the birds, the pigs, and the cows, and even the rabbits were moved to their own enclosures. It was a massive undertaking, but Emma knew it was the only way to keep the infection from spreading further. As the evening approached, they went back to their original plan, administering the new treatments recommended by Dr. Harris. Emma soaked rags in disinfectant and cleaned every surface she could reach, wiping down cages, feeding trays, and water troughs. She applied herbal remedies to the birds, hoping the ancient treatments would work alongside the modern antibiotics. Exhausted but resolute, Emma sat in the barn long after the sun had set. The faint light from a lantern flickered as she watched over the animals, feeling a strange mixture of exhaustion and hope. And then, just when she thought the day would end without any change, something remarkable happened. One of the cows, Rosie, the one who had been lethargic for days, stood up. Emma blinked, not trusting her eyes at first. Rosie took a few unsteady steps and then began to graze on the fresh hay that had been laid out for her. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could this be the sign she had been waiting for? Was it possible that the treatments had begun to work? She rushed over to Rosie, feeling her forehead. The fever was gone. The cow's temperature had returned to normal. Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she watched Rosie nibble on the hay, the signs of illness already starting to fade. The smallest of victories, but a victory nonetheless. Chapter 7. First Signs of Recovery. The first rays of sunlight broke through the morning mist, casting a warm glow over the barn as Emma stepped quietly into the animal pens. It had been a long, difficult week, but there was a shift in the air today. The animals were beginning to show the signs of recovery. The birds that had been so weak and lifeless now chirped softly and moved around their cages with more energy. Emma stood by the ducks, watching one of them eagerly peck at the scattered feed. Her heart swelled with cautious hope as she observed the changes. It had been days of constant care and monitoring, with long hours spent tending to the sick. But now, finally, the birds, at least some of them, seemed to be pulling through. The ducks, the hens, and even the turkeys had started to show more alertness, their bright eyes gleaming once more. It felt like a victory, however small, and Emma couldn't suppress a sigh of relief. She wiped her brow and smiled to herself. Maybe, just maybe, we're turning a corner, she whispered under her breath. John, though still weak from the illness that had laid him low, had insisted on helping more with the animals. Emma had tried to discourage him at first, knowing he wasn't fully recovered, but his resolve was unwavering. Slowly, he made his way into the barn, holding onto the wooden beams for support. He moved slowly, but there was something about his presence that lifted Emma's spirits. "Morning, John rasped, his voice hoarse but filled with determination. Emma looked up from the ducks and smiled. "Good morning. It's so good to see you up." John gave a faint chuckle, shaking his head. "I'm not dead yet. Not by a long shot." He had a point. Despite still feeling weak, he was improving, and he insisted on helping. They worked together, checking on the chickens, replacing their bedding, and making sure the water containers were clean. Emma marveled at how, even in his weakened state, John found strength in the act of caring for their animals. "It's a good feeling, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft as he watched the chickens pecking at the ground. "When they start to get better, you feel like it's all worth it." Emma nodded, her heart lightening. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to have something go right. "Yes, it really is. But we still have a long way to go." The sense of progress was palpable, but there was always the lingering worry about what else might be waiting to test them. Just as Emma began to let herself relax, she noticed something disturbing. The pigs, who had been acting fine just a day before, seemed lethargic. Their usual playful grunting had been replaced with low, weak noises. One of the sows was lying down with her head resting against the side of the pen, barely lifting it when Emma approached. "John," Emma said quietly, her voice filled with a new anxiety. "The pigs, they're not looking good." John looked over at the pigs, his brow furrowing in concern. "Oh no, not again." He pushed himself up, a little unsteady, but determined. "We can't afford to let anything else spread." They checked each pig carefully, noting the listless expressions and lack of appetite. Emma knew that the pigs were usually hardy animals, and seeing them so subdued was deeply worrying. She had hoped they were out of the woods, but it seemed another shadow was looming. "We'll need to isolate them," John said, his tone steady despite the tension. "We don't know if it's the same illness or something new, but we can't risk it spreading." Emma agreed, and together, they moved the pigs into a separate enclosure, away from the other animals. It was another task to add to their already overburdened shoulders, but they couldn't afford to ignore it. As they worked, Emma's mind raced with concern. Was it possible that the illness was adapting or worse, evolving? Once the pigs were settled into their new space, they began the arduous task of thoroughly cleaning the pens. It was something they had avoided for a while, too preoccupied with the immediate dangers of the infection, but now it felt like a necessity. They scrubbed the stalls, disinfected the feed and water bowls, and made sure every corner of the barn was as clean as possible. The work was exhausting, but Emma found that the act of cleaning, physically scrubbing away the dirt and grime, helped to clear the mental clutter that had accumulated over the past few weeks. John helped as best he could, his movements slower than usual but still purposeful. He lifted buckets of water, swept the floors, and even cleaned out the chicken coops. There was something almost therapeutic about the work, as if they were putting some distance between themselves and the chaos of the illness. It felt like a small victory in itself. As the day drew to a close, the barn looked spotless, the animals were secure, and Emma could feel a tentative sense of calm settling over her. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to relax just a little. As they sat down to a simple dinner that evening, there was a small flicker of joy in the air. The meal wasn't much, just some bread, cheese, and a bit of preserved fruit. But the comfort of it, coupled with the sense that things were beginning to turn around, made it feel like a feast. They sat together, quietly enjoying the meal, their minds momentarily free from the weight of the past days. John looked over at Emma, his face a little brighter than usual. "I'm proud of you, Em," he said, his voice low but sincere. "You've been amazing through all of this." Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, John. We're in this together." The simple acknowledgement of their shared efforts felt like a balm for the soul. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were starting to live again, even if just a little. But as with every day on the farm, things were never entirely calm for long. The next morning, as Emma was checking on the rabbits, she noticed something strange. One of them, a young doe, was lying motionless in the corner of her hutch. Her breathing was shallow, and she didn't respond when Emma gently touched her. Emma's heart sank as she realized that the rabbits, too, were now showing signs of illness. "Oh no," Emma whispered, her voice thick with dread. "Not the rabbits, too." She rushed to check the others, but it was clear that the illness had spread yet again. The rabbits, once healthy and full of life, were now lying still, their eyes dull. Emma's mind raced. "What is going on?" she thought as her pulse quickened. Just when they thought they were making progress, another obstacle had appeared. Chapter 8. A New Threat. The weight of uncertainty pressed down heavily on Emma and John as they stood in the barn, staring at the rabbits who now seemed to be succumbing to yet another unknown illness. They had just begun to feel a small glimmer of hope after seeing some recovery in the birds and the pigs, but now it felt as if the ground had shifted beneath them once again. The rabbits, so full of life just days ago, were now showing signs of the same lethargy and listlessness that had swept through the birds. The uncertainty in Emma's heart grew into something darker. "What is happening to our farm, John?" Emma whispered, her voice thick with worry. She was crouched beside the hutch, gently feeling the pulse of one of the rabbits. It was weak and slow. Her stomach churned with a rising sense of helplessness. How many more could they lose? John, still recovering from his own illness, stood beside her, his face pale but resolute. He didn't have any answers, but he knew they had to act fast. "We need to figure out what's going on, he said quietly. "This isn't just bad luck. It's too much for it to be." The situation felt more urgent now. It wasn't just the birds or the pigs, it was every animal on their farm. Emma's mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. Could they really be dealing with more than one illness at a time? The only thing they could do now was to dig deeper, to learn more about the symptoms, and to take every possible step to stop the cycle of sickness before it could destroy everything they had worked so hard for. They called the veterinarian again, hoping that this time they would get answers. The young vet had been helpful in the past, but there was something in his eyes this time that made Emma uneasy. Was he also running out of answers? On the phone, he spoke quickly and professionally, outlining potential causes. It could be related to an infection that came in with the nesting materials, he explained. If the bedding was contaminated by rodents or other animals, the germs could have spread throughout the barn. Infections often hitch rides on such things and can infect multiple species. Emma felt a knot form in her stomach. So, you think the nesting material could be responsible? The vet paused. It's one of the possibilities. It's important to isolate everything. Take away all bedding and disinfect every inch of your pens. But at this point, we might be dealing with something that could only be controlled with treatment and intensive care. It's not just about cleaning anymore. Emma sighed heavily. She had hoped that cleaning alone could have solved the problem, but it seemed there was more to it. The thought of more medications and procedures was overwhelming. Still, they had no choice. The barn had to be cleaned again, but this time it had to be done meticulously, without cutting corners. The couple spent the next few hours stripping the barn of every bit of bedding. They moved swiftly, but with care, disinfecting every surface, every corner where germs might hide. As Emma scrubbed the last of the stalls, she couldn't shake the feeling that, despite their best efforts, they were still fighting an enemy they couldn't see. They took extra precautions with the rabbits, cleaning their cages and providing fresh bedding, as the vet had instructed. But as they moved from one animal to another, the same feeling lingered. Would it really help? Would this time be different? Or were they just delaying the inevitable? As they were finishing the cleaning, Emma noticed that one of the rabbits, a young buck that had been particularly lively before, was now lying motionless in his cage. Her heart sank. "John, no," she whispered, as if saying the words would make it untrue. She rushed to him, lifting him gently in her hands. He was cold, lifeless, another loss. John knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We couldn't have done anything more. We've done everything we can, Em. We're not giving up." Emma bit her lip, trying to hold back tears. She had to be strong for him and for the animals. But losing another animal, another life she had tried so hard to save, felt like a crushing blow. They stood together in silence for a moment, feeling the weight of their shared grief. The barn, once full of life and energy, now felt like a cold, empty place. Despite all their efforts, they had been unable to prevent yet another death. How many more could they lose? How much more could they take? But just as Emma began to feel the despair setting in, John's voice broke through her thoughts. "We can't stop now. We're still in this. The vet said that with the right care, we can bring them back. We just have to keep going." He was right. As hard as it was, they had no choice but to keep fighting. They would not give up, not yet. They would do whatever it took to save the others, to protect the farm that had become their life. Later that day, after giving the animals fresh feed and water, they called the veterinarian back for another consultation. This time, the vet was more optimistic. "You're doing everything right," he said, his voice filled with reassurance. "With proper care, it's not too late for the remaining animals. But we need to act quickly and consistently. If you can keep them isolated and continue treating them, you can save them." His words gave Emma a glimmer of hope. Maybe they weren't too late. Maybe they could still save the farm, and all of the animals that had become like family to them. For the first time in a long while, Emma felt something other than exhaustion. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was hope, and in this moment, that was enough to keep going. Chapter 9. The Struggle with the Unknown. The days had been long and full of worry. Despite all their efforts, Emma and John still found themselves faced with uncertainty at every turn. They had saved some animals, but others continued to fall ill, leaving the couple exhausted and on edge. The discovery of the bacterial source, however, had given them a sense of direction, a glimmer of hope that perhaps they were closer to solving the mystery. But the farm was still not out of danger. John, though still weak from his own illness, had become more determined than ever. He paced the farmhouse, deep in thought, as he reviewed everything they had done. "There's got to be something we're missing," he muttered, his brow furrowed. "We've tested everything: feed, water, air. We've disinfected the barns, isolated the sick animals. Yet we still haven't found the root cause." Emma, sitting at the table, flipping through the notes she'd kept during their investigation, nodded in agreement. "I know, John. It's like we're fighting an invisible enemy." Both of them had done their best to keep the farm running, but they couldn't ignore the mounting sense of helplessness. They needed a breakthrough. Desperation was setting in, but they knew that panic wouldn't help. They had to stay focused. It was that evening when Emma suggested an idea that she hoped would lead them closer to the truth. "Why don't we test the barn's environment again? The feed and water are one thing, but what about the air? We haven't checked that yet. What if there's something in the atmosphere that's causing this?" John looked at her thoughtfully, considering her proposal. "You might be onto something. It wouldn't hurt to check. Let's do it." The next morning, they began their examination of the barn's air quality. John had managed to borrow some equipment from a nearby agricultural supplier, and Emma began testing for any trace of harmful bacteria, mold, or toxins. They worked in silence, the weight of the task hanging over them, as the testing kits beeped and clicked around them. The results came in slowly, but when they did, they were unsettling. Emma's hands shook as she read the test results aloud. "It's not the feed or water. It's something else. There's a bacterial presence in the air, some sort of airborne pathogen. It's not something we expected." John's heart sank. They had been so focused on what they could see and touch, on the physical things, that they had missed the more insidious source of the illness. "We've been cleaning everything religiously," John said, his voice tight with frustration. "But it's the environment itself, the air inside the barn. That's the vector." Emma's eyes widened in realization. The bacteria must have been breeding in the damp, poorly ventilated spaces in the barn. With everything closed off to contain the illness, we've just been trapping the bacteria inside. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but at least they now had a clue. The farm's ventilation was inadequate, and the bacteria were spreading through the air, infecting the animals. Emma immediately called the veterinarian, who confirmed their findings. "You've discovered the root cause," he said with a tired voice. "The bacteria must have come from contaminated bedding, but once the air became polluted, it spread like wildfire. You'll need to treat the barn's air as well as the animals." John and Emma took the news in stride, realizing that, for all their previous efforts, they had been fighting the wrong battle. Now that they knew what was causing the illness, they could work to eliminate it. For the next few days, they worked tirelessly to correct the ventilation in the barn. They installed fans to circulate fresh air, ensuring the entire barn was aired out and the pathogens wouldn't have a chance to thrive. Emma also made sure to use air purifiers, as well as herbal remedies known for their antibacterial properties, hoping they could further neutralize the airborne infection. As they began implementing these changes, they also introduced a course of antibacterial treatments for the animals, focusing on their lungs and respiratory systems, knowing that this was the root of the problem. They continued to check on the animals regularly, observing any signs of improvement. Over the course of the next week, they saw their first signs of success. The animals that had been lethargic and sickly began to regain their strength. The pigs, the rabbits, and the birds slowly showed signs of recovery. Even the waterfowl, which had been hit hard, started to perk up. It was a victory, though a small one. Still, Emma could hardly believe the change. The air, once thick with sickness, now felt lighter. It seemed that their hard work and careful attention were finally paying off. John, despite his still weakened state, could hardly hide his relief. "I think we're going to make it, Em. Look at them, they're coming back." Emma smiled at him, her face tired but hopeful. "I can't believe it. We might actually be able to save them all." But as with every victory on the farm, Emma knew that their work was far from over. There would always be something new to deal with. The farm was a living, breathing entity, unpredictable and full of challenges. The animals were her responsibility, and she wouldn't rest until she knew they were truly safe. As she watched the animals slowly recover, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Their battle with the bacteria was far from over, but this first victory meant that they were on the right path. The next day, as they finished their morning rounds, John turned to Emma, a glimmer of a smile on his face. "You know," he said quietly, "it's nice to see the birds outside again, isn't it?" Emma glanced up, her heart lifting. The birds, no longer confined to their pens, were out in the fresh air, pecking and stretching their wings as they should. The sight of them brought a warmth to her chest. "Yes," she said softly, "it's like the farm is waking up again." Chapter 10. A New Day. The days seemed to stretch out in front of Emma and John, filled with quiet hope and determination. They had fought through the darkest days of their farm's crisis, but now, as they stood at the threshold of recovery, they could finally see the light. The struggle was far from over, but the worst had passed. The farm, once on the brink of disaster, was coming back to life. Emma stood by the barn door, watching as the last of the chickens, which had been too weak to move just days ago, now scratched the ground in search of food. The hens that had survived the illness were slowly regaining their strength, their feathers growing back where patches had once been bald. She couldn't help but smile at the sight, her heart swelling with pride. "Look at them," she murmured, turning to John, who had just come out to join her. "They're going to be all right." John nodded, his face tired but full of quiet satisfaction. "It's been a long road, but we've made it through. I think we'll finally have our farm back." It had taken everything they had, their time, their energy, and their hearts, but the farm was healing. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. They had learned so much through this ordeal about the animals, about the land, and about themselves. For weeks, they had poured all their effort into finding the source of the infection, taking the advice of veterinarians, experimenting with new treatments, and making sure every corner of the farm was clean and safe. They had seen so many setbacks along the way, so many moments when they weren't sure if they could go on. But now, watching the animals thrive once more, they knew it had all been worth it. John stepped closer to Emma, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I think we've learned something important, haven't we?" Emma looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the calm relief that had washed over her. "Yes, patience and a willingness to keep going, even when things seem impossible. We didn't give up, no matter how hard it got. And now we're stronger for it." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as the animals grazed peacefully in the fields. The pigs were rooting around in the mud, their once dull coats now shining with health. The ducks and geese waddled around the pond, enjoying the warm sunlight. The rabbits, which had been so frail just a short while ago, now hopped about in the grass. Even the cows, though still a little slow, seemed content, grazing on the fresh pasture that Emma had carefully nurtured. "Look at them," Emma said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "They're all coming back. They're all going to be okay." John smiled warmly at her, his hand still on her shoulder. "We did it, Em. Together." Over the past few weeks, the once silent barn had come alive with the sound of clucking chickens and the gentle rustling of feathers. The hens that had survived the illness were starting to lay eggs again, and the anticipation of fresh, warm eggs in the morning was something Emma had come to cherish. It was a small thing, but after everything they had endured, it felt like a victory. The routine of the farm began to feel normal again. Emma and John went back to their daily chores with renewed energy, tending to the animals, checking on the gardens, and making sure everything was running smoothly. The joy they once took in these simple tasks had returned, and with it, a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. As the days grew warmer, Emma found herself sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset over the fields, a cup of tea in her hands. John often joined her, and they would sit in quiet contentment, their hearts at ease, knowing that their hard work had paid off. One evening, as they sat together, John turned to Emma with a thoughtful look on his face. "You know, I think it's more than just our hard work that got us through this. It was us. We've always had each other's backs, haven't we?" Emma smiled, her eyes sparkling with affection. That's what I think, too. It's our love for this place, for the animals, and for each other that has kept us going. That's what has gotten us through all the hard times. John chuckled softly. And it'll keep us going, for as long as we need it. They shared a quiet laugh, the sound carrying on the breeze, as the last light of the day faded behind the hills. Their farm, their life, was beginning to feel like it had before. Peaceful, full of purpose, and overflowing with love. The birds had come back, the animals were healthy, and the farm was thriving once more. And as the sun set on another day, Emma and John both knew one thing for certain. They had come through the storm together, and that was all that mattered.